Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's program. My name is Carl Ehrlich. I'm the director of the Israel Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies. And on behalf of the Koshitsky Center and our co-sponsors in this event, the York Center for Asian Research, I welcome you all to today's very special presentation and discussion by Dr. Mary Jane Ainslie of the University of Nottingham Ningbo campus. Before I briefly introduce Dr. Ainslie, I did want to offer a few words of thanks. First of all, to my counterpart at the York Center for Asian Research, Abedin Kusno, who unfortunately is unable to be with us today. But I also would like to welcome Josh Vogel of the Center for Asian Research and the Center for Jewish Studies, who will be representing the Center for Asian Research today. He's a colleague in the Department of History here at York University, and he will be leading the discussion following Dr. Ainslie's presentation. So thank you, Josh. I also would like to thank Dr. Laura Wiseman of the Center for Jewish Studies, who is the one who set up this relationship, as it were, with Dr. Ainslie, and it's thanks to her intervention that we were able to mount this program. And finally, I'd like to thank three people who are working here in the background to make sure that the whole program runs quite well. First of all, Julie Feinberg, the coordinator of the Center for Jewish Studies, and then our technical staff, Bert Ime and Grant McNair. So thank you to all of you. Dr. Mary Jane Ainslie is Associate Professor in Media and Communications and Deputy Head of School at the School of International Communications at the University of Nottingham Ningbo, China campus. Her research specializes in intercultural links across the Asia region, and she has won funding from the Korea Foundation, the Academy of Korean Studies, and the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Israel. She is the author of Anti-Semitism in Contemporary Malaysia, Malay Nationalism, Philosemitism, and Pro-Israel Expressions. And this book was published this past year, actually by now it's 2 years ago, 2019, by Palgrave Macmillan. Her fascinating topic today is Chinese philo-Semitism and historical statecraft, accosting Judaism into contemporary Chinese civilizationism. I welcome Dr. Ainslie and look forward to hearing her remarks. Thank you.
Okay, can everybody hear me? I hope so.
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to start sharing my screen just now. Okay, can everybody see my presentation?
Yes, we're good to go.
Great. All right, I wanted to make sure, first of all. Okay, I guess first, thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you for having me at your institution. I originally came to Canada for a month, and because of the situation, I ended up staying here a year. So it's been an interesting year, something I never expected, and I very much enjoyed myself here. So thank you for having me in your country. I'm hopefully returning to China tomorrow if all of the paperwork is in order. In the meantime, though, I've been looking forward to presenting my paper here. This topic was actually published in China Quarterly earlier this year. The title, of course, is Chinese Philosemitism and Historical Statecraft, Accosting Judaism into Contemporary Chinese Civilizationism. And there might be a few terms there that people aren't so sure about, but we will be exploring those later in the presentation. So first of all, I'll start by saying that as somebody based in China for quite a few years now, one element that has interested me is the significant increase of the engagement with Israel and Jews that we see in China on both a level of popular culture and an official level as well. So we see, for instance, the forming of Jewish centers and academic research institutes. Oops, have I just lost? There we go. Jewish centers and academic research institutes. We see academic talks. We see what I'd call cultural outreach activities. A great many of those happening recently within China. So we see this the celebration, as you see here, of Israeli Culture Week in Shanghai, in which we had the Shanghai Pearl Tower lit up in the colors of the flag of Israel. As I say, we see academic research institutes, we see cultural activities, all of these things happening very recently. So there's an increased interest in Judaism and Israel within China in the past few years. And this can really be traced back to around 2010, when we suddenly see what I would call an enormous boom in this kind of economic relationship between the two countries. And I'll read you a few kind of stats here as to the changes in this relationship, because they're quite extraordinary and worth hearing. So we see exports and trade between China and Israel increasing significantly. So civilian and economic relations replaced what was previously quite a sort of quiet military-based cooperation that dominated the Chinese-Israel relationship since its beginnings in 1992. We see a number of high-level diplomatic visits starting to occur between the two nations during this period. So high-level Chinese officials visiting Israel and the other way around from Israel to China as well. In 2014, we see the China-Israel Joint Committee on Innovation Cooperation that was established to promote collaboration between the two countries. And this partnership was so successful that by 2015, 40% of all venture capital going into Israel came from China. The Israeli Ministry of Economy also worked to support Israeli exporters in China with the Israel-China Task Force launched in 2015. We see large Chinese companies like Baidu, Alibaba, Ping An investing directly in Israeli science and technology. And by 2016, overall Chinese investments in Israel totaled $16.5 billion US. And that was a dramatic increase from around 50 million in the early 1990s. So we've gone from 50 million to 16 billion. In 2017, the volume of bilateral trade between the two countries totaled around 13 billion US. China invested more than 7 billion in tech innovation in Israel. China is now Israel's third largest trading partner, and it's largest in Asia, so representing Israel's second most important export market after the US. With exports of around 2.8 billion US dollars in the first half of 2018, and that's an increase of 80% compared to the first half of 2017. We see significant closer academic ties between Israeli and Chinese universities. So the opening up of overseas campuses, centers of Judaic studies opening up at major Chinese institutions, an increased amount of student exchange between the two nations as well. And we see Chinese tourism to Israel increasing by around 40% from 2016 to 2017. And in 2016, Israel and China introduced 10-year entry visas. And this is an agreement that China only shares with a very small number of countries. As of early 2020, this won't be the situation anymore, there were 13 direct flights a week from China, and there were 3 new Israeli visa centers that opened in Beijing, Guangzhou, and Shanghai. And some of these offered express lane 10-year visas within 24 hours. So this is a significant boom, I would say, in this relationship. And the US, as you say, is slightly worried about it. But this is mutually beneficial. Both of these sides win. Israel continues to see an influx of investment from China, and China begins to strengthen its presence in the Middle East, a region where it would like to play a greater role. Now, while all of those kind of stats and all of those figures might seem incredibly impressive, and indeed they are, they're not actually unique to Israel. It's part of what is known as the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, which is a massive overseas investment scheme, probably the biggest that the world has ever seen. It involves the wide-scale construction of infrastructure across the Eurasian region and Africa as well. So we're talking things like, for instance, the construction of airports, of ports, of railways, all of which are designed to bring these countries very close to China and to bring raw materials and people on a fast-track route to China. So everything is, this is designed to provide China with easy access to world markets through a highly modernized trade route. And the Middle East is quite an important part of such a plan here. So we see here, this is quite interesting, actually, having been based in Southeast Asia for a while. You see places like Burma, for instance, Pakistan, Kazakhstan. You see these countries changing rapidly due to Chinese investment. And they have been changed almost unrecognizably in the past 5 years, and it's due to the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, Israel actually is not so important to this because it is kind of a small country in this way. So it isn't central to the BRI, however, but it does have some importance. Israeli tech, agricultural tech in particular, has been a big part of the MOUs signed between China and Chinese and Israeli organizations. And as well, Israel kind of operates as a sort of gateway to the EU and to the African markets. So we see, in particularly in Haifa, of course, major Chinese construction there. So although Israel is quite small, and although it doesn't have kind of brilliant connectivity around the Middle East, it is still quite important to this. So we see a strong kind of investment in all of these countries and within Israel in particular. We're gonna come back to the Belt and Road Initiative later on. For now, there's also another element that we should talk about when we're talking about the BRI and the kind of construction of China now in the contemporary context, which is this notion of historical statecraft. Now, historical statecraft has been very important to the Chinese Communist Party, Communist Party of China, rather. There is a strong focus upon the reconstruction of the past within Chinese iconography. The Beijing Olympics becomes a very significant kind of representation of this, I should say. But since the late 2000s, this historical statecraft, so crafting the Chinese nation through this idea of a long and very significant and very distinctive history, and the kind of reconstruction or remaking of this, taking tools and iconography of the past, has become quite important to both Chinese nationalism, and also it has become a kind of means of legitimating Communist Party rule as well. So historical statecraft, I mean, all nations do this to an extent, and it's important in Israel as well, but we see a kind of heavy focus on China, on this within China right now. And again, we will kind of come back to this as such, because it becomes an important part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, Chinese Jewish history has also come under increased interest and is very much a part of this historical statecraft. Chinese Jewish history tends to be conceptualized along 3 stages. This doesn't mean that this is all it is. It's not. This is only kind of a very small snapshot of it. But these are kind of the eras and the communities that tend to be conceptualized and studied in this way. And there are really 3 of them. The first is the Kaifeng community of the medieval age. They're a very interesting sort of historical phenomenon. They were much studied in the 1990s. They didn't get very big at all. The sort of, I think maximum, I think it was around 6,000. And they kind of ended, I think, around the 16th century, around about that. There's a lot written about them, and it's very interesting. So there's a lot of study of them, and their kind of the way in which they sort of melded theological constructions of Confucianism and Judaism. The second sort of episode in Chinese Jewish history that tends to be studied and addressed is this growth of the Jewish communities throughout the 19th century in major cities like Harbin. If you go to Harbin in the north of China, you'll see some pretty fantastic synagogues amongst the pretty amazing Russian architecture up there. It's the most northerly major Chinese city is Harbin. It has a very interesting and quite traumatic history. We also see these communities further kind of bolstered by a movement of Jewish refugees outside of Russia after 1917 as well. So there tends to be some study around this. And then finally, which is the main focus nowadays in studies of Chinese Jewish history, there is, of course, the Shanghai refugee community, which was made up of people fleeing persecution in Europe in World War II. And again, we're going to come back to this. But this is kind of the 3 stages on which Chinese Jewish history tends to be conceptualized. There's a flurry, as I said, of recent interest in this history. And this coalesces with this general interest in historical statecraft and in the construction of Chinese history. So there's an increased interest in this. So we see the creation, the funding of things like memorials, of centers of academic research, of talks, of which I would put my own research also within that. The increased number of museums and the further further funding of those museums that already exist. So the Shanghai Jewish Museum, which sort of seems to get bigger every year, which is a fantastic museum. The restoration of things like old Jewish graveyards, for instance, and also we see increased number of publications, so papers, articles, and monographs. And also kind of like testimonies as well of people's recounting Chinese Jewish history, all very, very interesting. And then also a lot of popular culture too. So we see movies, TV shows, documentaries, plays, books, and even you'll see a musical as well, Shimmer, which was about the Jews of Shanghai. Now, all of this is basically encouraged by political and economic expediency. This kind of notion that currently, due to the increased links between China and Israel, these become an important part, shall we say, of bolstering those links, and they become what we call soft power. So soft power is kind of different to traditionally hard power. Hard power between nations would be things like forcing people to go along with your perspective, so through military means, for instance, through wars. Nowadays, we don't tend to use that, we tend to use soft power. Soft power, of course, defined by Joseph Nye, is the kind of ability to entice and attract and to demonstrate this as something that is positive and that you should kind of invest yourself in. It's often used, this Chinese Jewish history and this construction of it is often used as a kind of platform for China-Israel, the China-Israel relationship. And we see this Chinese Jewish history being referenced a lot by politicians from both Israel and China, and on kind of news sites as well. So the People's Daily, you'll see here, is a quote from the, this is kind of one of the mouthpieces of the Communist Party. It says, since ancient times, the relationship between the Chinese nation and the Jewish nation has been based on mutual appreciation and respect. And quote from the Israeli ambassador to China: Chinese and Jews are descendants of a long civilization. They attach importance to education, family, tradition, the pursuit of excellence. So this notion that there is some kind of a connection between these two peoples. And we see the funding and publication of research projects. Notice, for instance, here, these were actually funded by the National Social Science Fund of China, which is quite a prestigious award here. And you'll see that these research projects into Chinese Jewish history, what I'd highlight here is this idea that they are noted as having practical significance. So they're being again used as a platform to increase the economic relationship between China and Israel here. So this idea that the results of such studies have been applied in diplomacy, in China's diplomacy in this way. Now, this increased interest in Chinese Jewish history doesn't actually represent a theological engagement with Judaism. It's based often on a phenomenon that we call Philosemitism. And Philosemitism, on its very basic level, is almost kind of like the opposite of anti-Semitism. It involves cultural and racial stereotypes of Judaism and Israel, but these are positive stereotypes. It's a discourse that we can trace back to 19th century Europe. Sorry, my throat is a bit bad. I'll keep going there. And it has quite it originated in 19th century Europe. It has a complex relationship with the Israeli state because, as with most states, they do quite well out of this idea of positive attributes attached to the nation and its people. And it emphasizes qualities like the idea that Jewish people are very good with money, for instance. They're survivalists, they get through everything, they're entrepreneurs, they have a heightened intelligence, and that they have this kind of genetic superiority. So we're talking very social Darwinist here, but something that is very positive, as I said. So we see Philosemitism in China, and we see this having a strong development here. There's little analysis of Philosemitism outside of the Christian world. I've got a few kind of references there that are in existence. I put my own book on Malaysian Philosemitism in there as well. But it's something that's really only just beginning to be studied in places like Japan and South Korea and China as well. It doesn't have a theological basis within China. It can probably be traced to, as I say, the Baghdadi, the Indian Jewish traders in the 1800s and the 1900s there. And we see Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China, expressing such praise of Judaism and leading historical Jewish identified intellectuals such as Einstein, Marx, and Freud. They're all admired within China, specifically as Jews. So this developed, after 1992, it actually developed very quickly, and the establishing of relations between China and Israel in 1992, it developed quite quickly as a discourse. And it can be traced to around, it sort of got big around 2002, researchers say. Here we see a calming of the Israel-Palestine situation, and we also see some new kind of online information. We see sort of the growth of cyberspace, the access to more information within China. And it challenged the previous kind of position of China and Chinese people, which was very kind of pro-Palestinian prior to around 2002. Now, also, we see this being somewhat associated with this idea of an affiliation between Judaism and Confucianism. So emphasis on education and learning and filial piety being very important. This kind of draws parallels between these two ideologies. And you can see the kind of books that are actually available within China. They all kind of build on this philosemitic construction. So these books are available about Jewish people. So the idea that the Talmud is being sold as a business guide, and the idea of there being kind of Jewish wisdom in this way. So all of this, again, is about kind of making money. And these are racial and cultural stereotypes, but they are positive ones in this way. So these characteristics, these philo-Semitic characteristics in China, they take on these notions of positive governance, national identity, and they're transferred to this collective quality that is admired in Jews in the state of Israel. So these ideas such as moral refinement, advanced civilization, a will to survive, this heightened intelligence and wealth, and Jewish people being, and Israel in particular, as being brave and being innovative. So this is the image that we see within China that's developed particularly since 2002, and it is very prominent right now. Now, the reasons behind this, it's quite contextually specific here. The function of Philosemitism was part of providing a model of modernization during a period of rapid economic and technical advancement within China. This is what scholars see as being the function of Philosemitism. And this, interestingly, became a kind of model within China of Western success, Western economic and social success. So Jews in Israel began to be seen as kind of the pinnacle of everything that the West has to offer. And this, of course, is very ironic, given that Jews in Israel are very often othered within the West, particularly in Western Europe. And we see this a lot as part of kind of established Chinese discourse in post-2010. These quotes that I use in my research that were from Chinese social media. So the idea of Jewish people being smart, being biologically superior, of being business-minded, of being tough, all of these from both social media and from more legitimate state-sanctioned discourses as well. Now, what I argue in my research is that there is a little bit of a transformation here in the function of these discourses. Previously, of course, we see these as being part of this model of imagined modernization and this representation of success in the West in a time, as I said, that was quite important within China when it was changing dramatically. However, in the very recent context, this is very much tied to the BRI and to historical statecraft that I was talking about earlier. As part of supporting the BRI, there is an agenda from the Communist Party of remodeling the contemporary world to be Sinocentric. So in the complex and changing context of current day China, the positive qualities attributed to Jews in Israel become emblematic of more than merely Western modernity. The post-2010 constructions serve to support China as a global economic and moral center. The idea of this being an inevitable global superpower, so this narrative of cultural uniqueness and global superiority depends heavily upon evidence from history and placing China as central to this kind of crafted version of history. And this has to go beyond purely nationalist discourses, all right? It can't just be about Chinese nationalism. It has to be about what China can bring to the rest of the world. So there's a de-emphasizing of national boundaries, which involves a kind of exclusion of the Western world in this way and is much more focused upon Eurasia. And this idea that this Sinocentric identity now stretches across Eurasia, originating within China. So it's this notion of saying that kind of China is an inevitable global superpower, as I said. Now, I theorize the position of Jews in Israel within this, their adherence to this construction, through a notion from Rogers Brubaker, the theorist from UCLA, and what he calls, this notion of what he calls civilizationism. Civilizationism is particularly interesting, I find. It comes from his analysis of current far-right European organizations, in which there's far less of an emphasis upon nationalism, and there's much more on this idea of a much broader pan-European notion of civilization. And we see this in France, in the Netherlands, in Denmark. In these countries, there is less of a focus on nationalism. We see nationalism as part of the far right in the UK, and we see it in America in the very sort of nationalistic rhetoric of Donald Trump, for instance. But we don't see this in a lot of the far right nationalist or far right organizations of Western Europe. We do in Eastern Europe. But here what we see is a kind of characterization of the nation that invokes less emphasis on national differences and more on civilizational differences. And they tend to be embedded within notions of tradition, within this kind of notion of there being a kind of civilization, civilized past. And within this, Judaism and Islam become very important tools. It's interesting that these organizations would usually be very, very anti-Semitic. But instead, what they do as part of civilizationism is they have what Boubacar sees as this Philosemitic turn, which involves accosting Jews in Israel and putting them into their own narrative to reinforce their own superiority by attaching them to themselves to positive Philosemitic attributes. So this idea that Israel is now European and Jewish people in Israel represent a sophisticated form of modernity that is European, and that is something that these organizations now protect. And instead, the kind of other, the threat, becomes Islam. Okay. So we see this also within China, I argue, as part of historical statecraft and as part of the BRI. China is constructed very much as the historical savior and the continued protector of Judaism, particularly through the Shanghai Jewish refugee community. And this is an old narrative, this is not new. It can be traced to around 2000, the year 2000, when we see this kind of shift from a focus on the earlier Kaifeng Jews to the Shanghai refugees, this kind of shift of interest both in academia and popular culture. It largely focuses upon notions of Chinese benevolence. So this idea of China and its nation, the people and the government as personally responsible for the survival of Jewish people, very much countering previous negative constructions of China within Israel. We see an excessive use of maternal language and imagery in these depictions. So this idea, as you can see, Chinese people open their arms to Jewish refugees. Shanghai is a Noah's Ark of the Jews, this narrative of this language of sacrifice, of selflessness. And the idea as well that this is deliberate and collective state-led actions, this very nationalistic language, and it fed into nationalistic trends among Chinese youth. And this, of course, tends to be a kind of platform for contemporary China-Israel relations here. So what we see here, for instance, in this construction of this broader civilizationist identity and this xenocentrism and the BR as part of the BRI, we see Jewish people as being crucial to this construction. So this notion of the exclusivity of Chineseness. So this idea that only China was the nation in World War II that saved the Jews. And this, you see quotes like this, everyone knows that only China, only Shanghai, with open arms, welcomed Jews to her embrace. And this is to let you know the greatness of the Chinese people and let Chinese culture go international. We see these quotes from wider media here. Another kind of discourse that we strongly see supporting this is the idea of juxtaposing in the construction of the Shanghai Jews and Jewish people in general and Israel is this notion of Chineseness being juxtaposed with Japaneseness, which is associated as a kind of barbaric other. It becomes a barbaric other to the civilization itself. We see this idea that the Chinese people help the Jews despite Japanese oppression, and we see a sense of sympathy and commiseration, and this idea in the musical in Shimmer, Chinese and Jewish characters battle together against fascism, against the Japanese, and fought against fascism together. We also see this kind of juxtaposed with apathy and idleness from within Europe. So China as such is positioned as being kind of crucial to solving the problems of World War II. So this idea that other countries stood idly by, and only China opened her gate to the Jewish people when many European countries closed there, and they saved lives from Nazi tyranny. Chinese people tried our best to help Jewish refugees, and this is coming from, as you can see, from quite a senior level. Now, needless to say, there are problems with this narrative, with this construction. One being that it sidesteps the actual testimony we do have from survivors in the Shanghai Jewish communities. We have now, since the year 2000, a lot of published memoirs, a lot of historical analysis, all of which is fascinating and should be noted and should be read. And all of that is not a part of this narrative, is not acknowledged here. It also erases the hardship of the Jewish ghetto in Shanghai. Life was incredibly poor and incredibly difficult. And of course, there were many tensions with the local Chinese community. It overlooks the historical situation of Shanghai. What historians understand is that Shanghai was able, Jewish people were able to move to Shanghai because of the lack of a controlling power at the time. And it simplifies the sort of Japanese-Jewish relationship here. There's a really interesting historical analysis of the relationship between the Japanese regime and Nazi Germany and their understanding of anti-Semitism. They didn't quite get this. And there's even evidence of sympathy towards the Jewish refugees from the Japanese authorities. But it's very complicated. It's very, very mixed. And of course, it ignores the actual real heroes of this scenario, who are, you see the two pictured here, Ho Fangshan and Tsuneshi Sugihara, who are diplomats who actually, against orders, and Ho Fangshan particularly against the orders of the Chinese state, issued visas to Jewish refugees, allowing sort of thousands of people to flee to Shanghai. And both of them have been honored by Yad Vashem. And also, of course, when Jewish people arrived in Shanghai, then they were largely helped by their own community and philanthropists, Jewish philanthropists within their own community. So this wasn't something that was attached to kind of the Chinese state, really. That's what kind of historical analysis sort of tells us. There's also a problem with this narrative in that it is often used to sidestep any critique of these nations. And this idea, it's used sort of to construct both Israel and China as being kind of bastions of human rights in such a way. So we see this notion within the China Studies article here that I analyzed, saying China is one of the few countries that have always treated diasporas graciously as compatriots for a millennium. That's somewhat suspect, shall we say. And this was an article examining Chinese Jewish history here. And we see, for instance, as well, the opposite, the same thing happening within Israel. So when there was any kind of reference to the Israel-Palestine situation, there was immediate, by Chinese authorities, there's immediate kind of invoking of Chinese Jewish history to kind of just basically sidestep that very quickly. We see as well this notion of the recrafting and reappropriating of history in the 2015 celebrations of the end of World War II by China and Israel. So what purported to be a celebration of 70 years of the defeat of fascism was co-opted into celebrating 20 years of friendship between Israel and China. So basically becoming a means to support an economic agenda here. And there's also some extremely concerning matters regarding the unchecked development of Philosemitism within China. Ultimately, Philosemitism is still racial stereotyping. It's still reducing Jewish people to a distorted and exaggerated and exceptionalist view. And this is very dangerous within the Chinese concept, within the Chinese context, where we have a nation that places strong emphasis on ethno-nationalism, harsh treatment of ethnic minorities, and very negative attitudes to outsiders. This is kind of xenophobia and xenophilia are kind of two sides of the same coin, and they can switch quickly from one to the other, depending on the context. So the notion of Jewish people as being financially very adept can be a positive stereotype, but when it suddenly becomes threatening, it's flipped to the other side, that, you know, you have to control Jewish people, they will hoard all the money, this kind of idea. This stereotype can be used to both ends. So when Jewish people no longer adhere to this civilizationist narrative of Chinese global superiority, then this Philosemitism could quickly become anti-Semitism. And there is evidence of this. So we do see the beginning of negative racial stereotypes towards Jewish people in China, and access to more traditional forms of anti-Semitism, including things like Holocaust denial. So we're starting to see this for the first time entering China through cyberspace. And there is somewhat of a concern towards this. And also the treatment of the descendants of the Kaifeng Jews at the moment by the Chinese state, which is slightly worrying too, in that there's a notion that this internal Jewish identity could actually threaten Chineseness in a sense. And so there is a kind of concern around this, I would say, of its potential. Okay, all right, that's my presentation. I know that there were some bits that I went over quite quickly, so I'll be quite happy to elaborate and quite happy to take all forms of questioning.
So shall I? Oh, here we are. Before I am going to do this with the chat function, so I will open that up. Let me make a couple of points as people start asking questions. Do we want to do it that way? Is that the best, Carl? Should we do it through the chat function?
Well, that's a good way for seeing, well, the participants list. If people raise their blue hands there, they can volunteer to ask questions, or they can ask questions through the chat function. If they don't want to speak, they can just type their answers in. Can
I have access to all 53 participants?
Yes, you can.
Just by clicking?
Click participants.
Miraculous.
There also is a Q&A function at the bottom. Sorry.
Oh, there's 53 people that came on. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's amazing. Let me ask you, let me just make a couple of quick points, and then I will, oh boy, we have people with questions. The Kaifeng community, which it never really numbered more than 1,000 or 2,000. It was, the city of Kaifeng was the capital of China at that time, but it was, and it finally dissolved very early 20th century. They sold off their last Torahs and everything. You can still visit the what do they call the foundation stones? You probably have in the museum there in Kaifeng. And the other thing about Harbin is very interesting. The Chinese will date it back to the medieval period, but Harbin was founded in 1898, so it doesn't go back anywhere. But if you date it to 1898, then it has to be a Russian-founded city. If you go back further, then it can be a Chinese city. You know, it fits many of the kind of stereotypes that you hinted at. Let me see if I can.
Yeah, I haven't managed to visit the old the Kaifeng settlement. I'm really looking forward to doing so. It's
fun. It is fun.
I've been to Harbin, but not to Kaifeng yet.
In an earlier lifetime, I guess, I studied Japanese anti-Semitism, and it's like a mirror image of what you just described. It's so interesting. These Jews, they're so smart. They can do all this stuff, but you better watch out, because when you go to sleep, they're still up, and they could stab you in the back. So it's two sides of the same coin. Just like, I haven't heard the term before, an allo-Semitism, but I can take it apart. I like that. That works very well. Let me throw it open to questions, and I don't. Where do I? Oh, attendees. Let me click on attendees, and I don't see any questions yet.
No, Josh. If you look at the bottom under Q&A, there are 3 questions already.
Q&A under what? Under panelists? What?
At the very bottom, it's of your
Q&A.
screen.
Oh, thank you, Carl. Okay, so Richard Fung asks, can you talk more about the shifting attitude to the descendants of the Kaifeng community?
yes, but only a little bit. Maybe Josh is more of an expert. Well, Josh certainly is more of an expert in this, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about the contemporary context here. I know from the New York Times article, it's quite interesting, where there have been descendants of the Kaifeng community that are sort of rediscovering their ancestral roots in this way, and have been somewhat prevented from doing so due to the potential that this can challenge Chinese communist identity. And of course, this comes at a time of oppression of other ethnic minorities, the Islamic ethnic minorities, for instance. So there is a concern that this could also present a similar challenge to Chinese identity as associated with the Communist Party. I think that's what really is occurring at the moment. It's not, you could say it's not a significant form of oppression. It's not comparable to what's happening elsewhere to other minorities, but it is a kind of sign, a signal, shall we say, that we're not going to take any potential reassessing of any reassessing forms of identity that could provide a challenge to that of state identity.
Sounds good to me. Let me ask you another question here.
Look at the New York Times article because I think it was very good.
Good. This is a question from Sandy Halpern. Do you really feel there is a true interest in Jews, or is it that China is more interested in Jewish areas of success, for example, in technology, or for their own interest in world domination? That's kind of a strongly worded question.
Yeah, an overseas investment scheme is what I would use rather than world domination, shall I say. There is certainly true interest in Jewish history, in Jewish theology, but inevitably when we start investigating things like this, it tends to be through the lens of the contemporary situation and our own position right now. So I would say that this genuine interest is filtered through the way in which this is presented and the economic interests of the Chinese state right now. So I wouldn't say that this doesn't represent a genuine interest. I think we have to think about what we mean by the term genuine in this way. Does that answer the question?
A person can raise it again if they feel not. Let me ask you this. You remember about maybe 10 years ago, it happened to me that a friend of mine said, "Hey, Josh, what is this about all Koreans are reading the Talmud, you know?" I said, "What are you talking about?" And I'm surprised that any Koreans are reading. And he sends me an article, and I spent, I don't know, half an hour on the internet going through a million websites. And I think you had the Chinese equivalent on one of your slides that somebody had published a book on how to be successful, all the business knowledge you can possibly want in 100 pages, right?
Yeah, a manual for business success.
Do you know what I'm talking about? I don't know the details, but there must have, was that the Chinese equivalent of something? All the secrets of the world in business can be taught through learning, a couple of passages in the Talmud.
Well, I mean, China does have its own models of business success very much. So I think this is in addition to that. But yes, there is the use of Jewish, you notice the term of Jewish wisdom is associated with being economically and business savvy in this way. And yes, there is an emphasis on using texts like the Talmud to do that. There is also a sort of, I did touch on this sort of interest in drawing comparisons between Confucianism and Judaism, but that doesn't seem to have filtered down into popular culture, is what I'd say.
Okay, Kiefer Wong asks, can you speak more about the erasing and growing evidence of anti-Semitism in China? You mentioned how this is linked to a possible shift from positive to negative stereotypes, but is there something beyond this possible shift?
I think basically my point is that there is anti-Semitism in China, but it is somewhat ignored by both Chinese and Israeli sources, simply because this construction of China as being a land without anti-Semitism is a very positive construction, one which helps the economic relationship between these two nations right now. But I would say that certainly there is growing evidence from scholars studying this that there is anti-Semitism in China. And there are more kind of modern forms of anti-Semitism, shall we say, like conspiratorial discourses and particularly Holocaust denial that have come into China from cyberspace. And there's also, this is one thing I look at in Malaysia when I'm talking about the form of anti-Semitism there. There's a notion that this anti-Semitism, which began in Malaysia as a form of kind of Malay nationalism and Islamic nationalism, is becoming attached to older forms of European anti-Semitism. It's becoming embedded in older forms of European anti-Semitism. And I think the same is somewhat true in China, because when you have the internet, you have access to everything in this way. So it's kind of inevitable that there will be some of this, these discourses and these beliefs coming into the country. And scholars note that there isn't really acknowledgement of this. Instead, there's this narrative pushed of China save the Jews, or China is a land without anti-Semitism. As regards the switch from positive to negative, I wouldn't sort of say I have any direct evidence of that right now within my own research. It's the issue that this is sort of not just myself, but scholars guard against this, because they're like, within the Chinese context, within this sort of heavily racially stereotyped society, there is the potential for this to develop. And we see this, as I say, from it coming in from cyberspace, from the oppression of the descendants of the Kaifeng Jews as well. So I hope that answers, I think, that question.
Okay, very good. Next question is from Bun Li Yang. What do you see as possible policy moves of the Chinese government this coming year in terms of infrastructure investment in Israel? Predict the future. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I can't do that. I can't say that. I would say that the investment in Israel tends to be Israeli tech, the use of Israeli tech, particularly agricultural tech, Israeli startups, and also, of course, the building of ports like Haifa, Chinese investment in ports like Haifa. That's from my own research that I was conducting. That was what was mostly noted. So I can't talk about any kind of new infrastructure or anything that's happened right now.
Okay. Here's a question from one of our colleagues, who's professor of Jewish history, David Kaufman. I missed a good chunk of the lecture off the top, so feel free to ignore my question if it was covered. I'm curious about 1, Chinese Jewish intermarriages in the diaspora, and 2, the impacts, I apologize for his grammar, the impacts of Chinese Christianity's discovery of Jesus's Jewishness, curiosity about Jewish religious practice, and interest in accessing Hebrew. Speak of any of these, please.
I think Joshua is probably more of an authority than this. These are not questions that I can really answer. But the second, actually both of them are something that I could speak a little bit more in the Southeast Asian context, in kind of Malaysia and Singapore, in that there was a phenomenon, I know in Singapore in particular, of intermarriage between Jewish women and Chinese men. And a lot of it was based on sort of economic convenience between kind of Jewish women who would be kind of refugees almost from Russia, and up and coming kind of Chinese businessmen in Singapore. This was sort of very convenient kind of marriage. I know there's evidence of that in the early 20th century. And the second one, what I did find evidence of this within Malaysia, within Malaysian Christians who are a persecuted minority in Malaysia, and also in Muslim Malays who are kind of disaffected and not happy with authoritarian control over their religion. There's a lot of interest in the links between Judaism and Christianity and Islam, which are becoming a sort of alternative form of their own religion, or carving their own relationship to their own religion away from state discourse. But I can't talk about that in China. Maybe Joshua is more of an expert there.
I'll have coffee with David at some point, and I don't really know the answer. They're interesting questions, but I don't know the answer. Martin Nash asks, a foundation of Judaism is the sanctity of life. Is this addressed in this accord? I guess he means, do the Chinese address this when they approach the study of Judaism?
Not that I have seen.
Okay.
It tends to be much more sort of superficial. It doesn't tend to be a theological deep engagement in Judaism, not on a popular level, certainly.
Okay. Munjira Jefford asks, oh, this is great. I have to leave for another meeting. I'm sorry. That's a message rather than, I'm sorry, a question. Bill Liu asks, oh, here's an interesting question. What is China's stance on Palestine? Is it mentioned much, if at all, in popular government or online discourse? This
is very, very interesting, certainly. And Joshua, again, I'm sure you can speak about this as well. I mean, prior to the 2000s or the 1990s, maybe, China allied itself very closely with the Palestinian authorities, not because it was particularly concerned with Palestinian human rights, but because, of course, this was a way of positioning itself in opposition to the West and to Europe and America. When, of course, that opposition in the world broke down, then there is a movement away from Chinese authorities towards sympathizing with the Palestinian authorities. And you see, there are quite a lot of articles I found about sort of saying things like, has China abandoned the Palestinians in sort of favor of the economic convenience of now having a relationship with Israel? And there is still sympathy with the Palestinian situation from Chinese people and from older Chinese people who sort of remember this positioning of the Chinese state. And so one thing sort of I did see was that you will see Chinese authorities paying lip service to this and sort of occasionally saying, oh yeah, we very much sympathize with the Palestinian plight, but they're not actually doing anything and just continuing all of their economic relationship and funding of Israel in this way. So there is a recognition of this previous position, but it somewhat doesn't continue. It's kind of what I'd say. And you did see, I think one of the quotes on my slide was from one of the Chinese authorities kind of almost covering his back by saying, oh yes, we want a two-state solution, we want peace for everyone and stuff. And then I think it was Netanyahu or whoever immediately coming in there and sort of using Chinese Jewish history and, to sidestep that issue, and which is something that wasn't challenged and which is fine with the Chinese state. So there's kind of lip service as to this positioning, but I would say that there is a very much a movement away from having and from supporting the Palestinian authorities within China due to economic convenience.
This is a question from a student at Dartmouth, quite a ways away from here, but that's great that you've got the wonders of the internet, who's written on the subject. I'm not going to go into depth. This is a difficult question, but I'll throw it out there and let you answer it as you wish. Could you elaborate on the opinion the Japanese and Korean public has on Jews?
Only from what I have read when I was researching Philosemitism in Asia, which was that it was there sort of somewhat before in China. It was in China, and I think some of these discourses actually, these Philosemitic discourses, actually spread to China through these countries probably. I mean, South Korea and Japan seem to be extremely Philosemitic in their construction of Judaism. And again, this is very stereotypical in this way. And you see books like, for instance, The Elders of Zion is available in Japan and South Korea, but is a manual as to how amazing these people are. Look at this world domination. Isn't that fantastic? Oh, we've got to try this. This is this kind of these positive racial stereotypes. so that was what, and from talking actually from Israeli academics who study Israel and South Korea, this was their experience in these countries. A lot was sort of, people saying, oh, tell us how you do it, guys, this is great. So that's all I can say on that.
There's years ago, I met a Japanese scholar of Jewish history who he was quite old already he was born around the turn of the century, and he was already quite old in the mid 80s, of course. And he, at some point in the post-war period, I think it was Rabbi Herman Dicker who wrote a wonderful book about this, and some Japanese had approached him as the rabbi in the 1950s and said, I hear you people are incredibly successful in business, and I'm thinking of converting so I can become successful too. And so Dicker didn't know how to deal with this. So he approached this Japanese professor and he said, what do I tell him? He says, tell him the first step is circumcision. That'll end the discussion right there. David has another question. Just curious, does anyone know if there are Jewish agencies in the diaspora or parts of the Israeli intelligence world that are deploying bots to disrupt cyber anti-Semitism?
No idea.
No idea. Yeah. Okay, good. Let's try another question. In Israel, this is from Shoshana El-Harar. In Israel, there are some voices who oppose China's investment in Israel, the feeling that they buy more and more companies there. Would you know something about that?
Not specifically in Israel, but throughout the countries that are undergoing rapid Chinese investment as part of the BRI, yes, there is opposition towards that. There's the movement there's often kind of there are ethical issues around this investment. So the building of dams, the building of railroads, people being expelled from their land, the movement of large quantities of Chinese workers into areas, for instance, with inevitable tensions ensuing, the building of casinos and of massive infrastructure. There's and also some quite unfair sort of and dubious financial kind of arrangements between the governments of some of these poorer nations and that of China. So there are a lot of ethical issues around this, I would say. And yeah, I'm sure there are issues within China as such, within Israel, sorry, as such as well. But the BRI is a fact. It's there. It's not going anywhere.
Another question from the same woman, Shoshana El-Harar. And what is China's interest in Africa? We hear that they invest more and more there.
Again, the BRI is, as you know, Joshua, these nations within Africa like Botswana, Ethiopia, they have upcoming economies, and China is very much wanting a foothold in this part of the world and East Asia in general as well. And yes, it is investing more, it is constructing infrastructure, it has exchange agreements. We're seeing more and more African students in China at the moment on scholarships. And yeah, Chinese African links are significant in their development right now.
China, even when Mao Zedong was alive, was investing in Africa. They were, they looked playing the long game and built the Tanzanian Railroad famously. But now, of course, you're right. It's part of them. There was no Belt Road business back then, but now, of course, it's part of a global strategy or something.
Accelerated, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see. We have another question. Are you doing okay, by the way, or do you want to?
No, I'm good. I'm good.
You're good. All right. We have a couple more. Could you please, this is from Mr. Alvin Young, could you please elaborate on the concept of historical statecraft? How do you define it? From which theorists do you draw? Is Philosemitism in China advanced by the Chinese state, or it develops organically?
Okay, historical statecraft. One thing I do sort of want to say here is that all of this paper's research has actually been published in the China Quarterly, which is an open access journal. So you can just simply search for the title of the paper and the presentation and find the paper if you want to read it. And all of my references and all the quotes that I use are within there. Historical statecraft comes from Maximilian Mayer, who was actually a former colleague of mine, published in 2018 in the Journal of International Affairs, in which basically in which he talks about Chinese historical statecraft and analyzes the Beijing Olympics displays particularly in depth, and the kind of recrafting of Chinese history. This idea that you are recreating history, which China does very well. It tends to knock things down and then build them again, and build them in keeping with a presentation of history that that supports the current state. So yeah, this notion of constructing and accosting history to create a modern nationalist, semi-nationalist, shall we say, form of identity. And the theorist is Maximilian Mayer. And the second question is, Philosemitism in China advanced by the Chinese state, or did it develop organically? That's an interesting one, because I think it will be difficult to actually distinguish between those paths, in that, yes, it has very much been supported and promoted by both the Chinese and Israeli states, but also as well to an extent, it has developed organically given access in Chinese cyberspace. You could say anti-Semitism is also developing organically in that way, possibly as well, and access to the Talmud and the use of that as a business guide, all of this. I almost feel it would be impossible to unentwine those two discourses. I think they very much come together.
You mentioned, I don't know if you meant this, the protocols of the elders of Zion, this horrible late 19th, very early 20th century Russian text. I did some research on it in Japan, again in the late 80s. I found 8 distinct translations into Japanese, all by notorious anti-Semites, of course. Has that appeared in Chinese translation? It must have by now.
I would imagine so.
Yeah.
I haven't found reference to it in China. It's in Malaysia, certainly.
That wouldn't surprise me, yeah.
Translations are available in bookshops and very distinguished bookshops in Kuala Lumpur. But that's another presentation.
There was a period, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, continue.
No, there was a time in the late 1980s when you could walk into even a university bookstop, let alone a more public one in Japan, and you would find a little Jewish corner, they called it, where you would have all the latest books, because they were publishing them, like, business guides and all the kinds of things that you're seeing, that you demonstrated from the Chinese context. And then it disappeared. It was a fad. They call them a boom in Japanese. It was a boom and it disappeared. So I'm wondering if the differences was pointed out in one of these questions recently, is that the state is much more involved. The state is inevitably involved in China in a way that it wasn't in Japan. Mm-hmm. So I can't imagine it's going to disappear like a puff of smoke. Do you have any thoughts along those lines? Is it with us for some time?
As to whether or not this kind of interest in Judaism disappear?
Right, Philosemitism, etc.
Philosemitism. That's interesting, because the thing is that we do see China developing, like I said at the beginning when I gave all those stats as to how impressive this Chinese-Israel relationship was and this investment in China. You go to other countries around China and you'll find the same kind of thing going on there. So it's sort of interesting as to what extent this exists alongside other kind of discourses too. So the depictions of African countries are very prominent, very interesting in China. And again, they tend to be very stereotypical. Yeah. They tend to be kind of positive stereotypes, but stereotypes and racial stereotypes nonetheless. So as to the extent to which all of this will continue, I don't know. It would depend, I think, on what happens with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Anyone else have any questions? Well, in that case, let me just say that this was very, very. Did you want? Oh, there another one?
Yeah, I think there's one more at the bottom there. I just saw.
Oh, you're right, there is. One more question for Mary from Kiefer Wong again. Thanks again for the great presentation. Can you elaborate on Brubaker's 2017 concept of civilizationism? Yes, that's interesting, especially if it transcends nationalist sentiments and how this applies to China's relations.
Yeah, I find this very interesting too, as well. And as a concept, I was sort of interested as to how it fits within China, because it kind of doesn't, you know, it's enough of a fit that I think it can be paralleled with the European context. Basically, as I was saying in my presentation, that a lot of the European far-right organizations tend to be not very nationalistic in their discourse. They tend to have this notion of kind of civilizationism and European civilizationism as being sort of superior. As I say, it's not really a discourse that you see in Eastern Europe, and it's not one that you see in the UK, and it's not one that we really see in America. Those contexts remain quite nationalistic. But we see them, as I say, in countries like kind of France, like the Netherlands, like Denmark. And I think what was quite interesting about them is the notion to which they accost Jewish people in Israel. So they would traditionally have been, as I said, quite anti-Semitic, but now they tend to be quite philo-Semitic. And the other that was previously Judaism now becomes Islam and Muslim people. And they use kind of Israel and Judaism to position themselves as kind of protectors or nurturers of this kind of civilizationism, which becomes represented in a sort of pinnacle through a pinnacle of this seems to be represented through Judaism and the positive attributes of Philosemitism. So I see the same kind of thing going on, I would say, in China. And this is where I see the 2010 construction of Jewish people changing slightly. Whereas before, you have this notion of Jews in Israel as representing the pinnacle of the West and the achievements of the West. Now you see much more about China as having been the kind of protectors of this and the nurturers of this. And this was a discourse that can be traced back before the BRI, but has become much more prominent within the BRI, because in a sense, the BRI does rest on a form of Chinese civilizationism. The creation of a Sino-centric world can't be something that is purely nationalistic. It has to go beyond the borders and position China as being the kind of the pinnacle of the world in this way, the modern center of the world to which everything will now be drawn. And people keep saying that, you know, the next decade, the next couple of decades will be Sino-centric. Does that perhaps answer the question, maybe?
You know, what you were saying is very interesting in the context of France, and you can see it in the transition from Jean Le Pen to Marine Le Pen, where he was an anti-Semite and she is now, they're all Islamophobes, that's no question about that, but the transition has been made there in the generation on the far right.
Yes, it is, it's very interesting.
A little scary, but it's very interesting too. Any other questions from the floor? From the, whatever we call this, the cyber floor? Carl, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, just one point, or well, actually a couple of points here. Not necessarily about Mary's talk, but we have had the question whether this talk will be posted on the web for viewing later, and it will be on the Center for Jewish Studies YouTube channel. And for more information about how to find the YouTube channel, you'll have to speak to our coordinator, Julie Feinberg, or if you aren't able to find it by Googling, just send her an email at cjs@yorku.ca, and she'll be able to tell you how to find the link. One very quick observation, and this does follow on Mary's talk, where Mary, you spoke about the danger of philosemitism. And having lived for a number of years in Germany, I can say that this goes back already 30 years, my experience, that the Jewish community there is actually much more worried about the Philosemites in German culture than they are about the anti-Semites, because the anti-Semites, they can identify and they know who they are and they know what their attitudes are. But the problem with the Philosemites is that their attitudes can shift from one day to the next, from extreme Philosemitism to extreme anti-Semitism, if the Jews don't live up to their preconceived notions of what they are like. And finally, one sort of question here. I don't know if you want to take the time yet to answer it, because I know we're running low on time. And it's following up on Kiefer Wong's latest question about the concept of civilizationism, sorry. I'm wondering whether what the relationship is between this concept and Samuel Huntington's concept of the clash of civilizations, where certainly Chinese civilization plays an important role in his concept of this clash of civilizations. And I'm wondering if there's any relationship or if you've thought about the issue at all. So that's it. Thank you. After this, it's over to Josh for the rest.
No, that's not a sort of connection that I've made. So thank you very much for bringing that up, because that is very interesting to think about.
I think possibly it's just the word sound alike, but I'm not sure either. That's something to think about, Carl. Anyway, I want to thank Mary for this talk. You covered so many interesting bases, from China's involvement in Israel, well beyond what I had imagined. You see them everywhere, but I didn't realize it. And I was a couple of years ago walking around the port in Haifa and was kind of stunned at all the vessels there. There's more to Haifa than the port, of course, but the port is pretty impressive, I have to say. And then this interesting question that we've come back to that you dealt with so interestingly, between Philosemitism and anti-Semitism. And we saw Carl mentioned similar concerns in contemporary Germany, and I've seen it in contemporary and pre-war Japan as well. So I have to say, I thought I knew a lot about this, but now I realize I have a lot left to learn. So I want to thank you on behalf of all the various institutions here at York University for this talk. And I hope you get back to China tomorrow. I hope that works out.
Okay. No, thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure. And thank you for the very interesting questions too.
Good. Mary, do they test you at the border when you get into China? Will they test you for COVID?
Hello?
Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I think this is still recording.
Yeah, host has stopped your video. All right, let me put my video back on.